In England, there was a crime darker than murder, more unforgivable than heresy. A crime that struck not just at the body of the king, but at the fragile order of the realm itself. They called it high treason, and for it, there was no mercy, no quiet death, no grave that might preserve a man's dignity. For treason demanded more than blood. It demanded annihilation. The traitor's life would be torn apart piece by piece, so that even memory itself was reduced to ash. The law dictated a ritual, cruel in its precision. First came the rope, not the merciful drop of the gallows, but a strangling cord, drawn tight enough to darken vision, to crush breath, to force a man into that twilight place where death seemed certain, yet denied. He was made to taste the nearness of release, only to be dragged back, coughing, convulsing, his body denied the one kindness it begged for. The rope was not an execution, it was a prelude, a cruel reminder that his suffering had only begun. Then came the knife. Its edge caught the light like a serpent's tongue, sharp enough to part not just flesh, but the very secrets of a man's being. Before the eyes of the crowd, the belly was opened, its warmth spilling into the cold air. The heart that once beat with loyalty, the lungs that once drew the breath of freedom, these were torn out, lifted, displayed as trophies of betrayal. The traitor's insides became a sermon, his pain a scripture, his destruction the lesson preached to all who watched. And still it was not enough, for treason required the breaking of the body itself. 4 ropes were tied, each bound to a limb, each leading to a horse bred not for war, not for labor, but for the grim theater of death. Whips cracked, hooves thundered. The animals strained in opposite directions. Flesh tore, sinew snapped, bones gave way. The man who once walked whole upon the earth was scattered into quarters, transformed from human to spectacle. And when the rending was complete, his parts were borne away, an arm to one city, a leg to another, a head upon a pike above the gates of London. No corner of the kingdom was free of the warning. This is treason's price. This was not justice. Justice is blind, measured, impartial. This was theater, deliberate, excessive, staged for the gaze of thousands. It was a performance written in agony, choreographed by fear, designed to carve obedience into the marrow of the people. At Tyburn, beneath the looming gallows, justice became spectacle, and the spectacle was meant to endure. The crowd gathered not merely to witness, but to be shaped by what they saw. Men clutched their cloaks tighter, women turned pale, children were hoisted upon shoulders to behold the lesson etched in blood. The air thickened with the mingling of torch smoke and human dread. Every rope, every iron hook, every gleaming blade seemed to whisper a single truth. The crown would not forgive betrayal. To rise against the king was to be unmade before the eyes of the kingdom. And so it was that Thomas Armstrong, once a knight, once a man of station, found himself at the center of the stage. He had played his part in conspiracies whispered against Charles II, and for that, the script of treason had already been written for him. The rope awaited his throat. The knife awaited his belly. The horses awaited his limbs. Here in the shadow of Tyburn, he stood gaunt but unbowed, his face lit by the flicker of torches, his fate already sealed. Around him the murmur of thousands swelled like an ocean that came not to save but to drown him in its gaze. His breath steamed in the cold, his eyes searched the gallows, and though his heart still beat within his chest, he knew the law would soon rip it free. This was not the end of a single man. This was the theater of fear itself, a theater that demanded silence from the living, obedience from the doubtful, and terror from the restless. A theater that awaited with all its cruel precision the body and soul of Thomas Armstrong. Sir Thomas Armstrong had once been a man of stature, a soldier forged in campaigns, a knight adorned with honor, a trusted servant beneath the banner of the crown. His sword had once defended the very throne that now condemned him. Yet in the England of Charles II, loyalty was not the shield it had been in ages past. It was brittle, fragile as glass, and suspicion spread faster than truth. The kingdom still bore scars from civil war, from regicide, from the execution of a king whose blood had soaked Whitehall's scaffold. Shadows of that trauma lingered, and every whisper of conspiracy seemed to echo the chaos of decades before. In taverns, in parlors, in the darkened chambers of London, men spoke of liberty, of Protestant cause, of the tyranny of succession. And it was in those whispers that treason found its voice. The Rye House Plot, a name that still chills the marrow of English history. Its design was audacious, its scope immense. To strike down not only the king, Charles II, but also his brother James. Two heads severed in one stroke, leaving the succession shattered, the monarchy broken, the kingdom thrown open to new masters. The conspirators envisioned ambush on a lonely road, the royal carriage trapped by fire, steel, and gunpowder. In their minds, it was not murder, but salvation. In the eyes of the crown, it was the darkest treachery. And as the plot unraveled, so too did the lives of those ensnared in its net. Names were whispered, denounced, dragged before tribunal and scaffold alike. Some confessed under duress, others proclaimed innocence to deaf ears. In such storms, truth itself was powerless. And among those whose names were carried on the bitter wind was that of Thomas Armstrong. The flash of steel gave way to the crash of boots. Soldiers moved like shadows down narrow London lanes, their torches staining the night with cruel light. In secret chambers where men once bent over maps, plotting the unmaking of a king, doors were splintered, parchment scattered, hope extinguished. The whispers of rebellion were drowned by the harsh bark of orders, the rattle of chains, the cries of men caught between loyalty and survival. Armstrong was seized, not as the knight he had once been, but as quarry. Shackles bit into wrists that had once borne the weight of a sword in defense of England. His body was dragged through the filth of London's streets, past the very crowds that had once cheered him. Mud clung to his boots, jeers clung to his ears, and above it all, the iron toll of the Tower bells echoed, a sound that did not herald sanctuary, but doom. For the Tower of London was not merely stone and iron. It was a vault for the condemned, a fortress where suspicion hardened into guilt. Its walls had witnessed centuries of betrayal and confession wrung from broken bodies. Now they prepared to welcome Armstrong. In those days, conspiracy was not just a crime, it was a contagion. To be accused was often to be condemned. Fear clouded judgment, and the line between rumor and reality blurred until no man could tell where treachery ended and survival began. Armstrong's name had been spoken, and that was enough. Once caught in the snare of the king's suspicion, there was no path back to honor. He was not alone in his fall. Lords, commoners, soldiers, and poets alike found their names entangled in the Rye House plot. Some met the news swiftly, some endured the slow grind of interrogation. Each became a fragment in the larger theater, each a warning to those who might dare whisper rebellion again. Armstrong's fate was sealed not only by what he had done, but by what the crown needed him to represent. And so the man who had once ridden proudly in the king's service now rode bound in chains, his body paraded through the streets as spectacle, his honor already stripped before the blade had even touched him. The eyes of England turned toward him, not in admiration, but in accusation. This was the true power of conspiracy, not merely the plots themselves, but the fear they bred. Fear turned loyalty brittle, turned suspicion into weapon, turned men like Armstrong into scapegoats upon whom the weight of treason could be displayed. The Tower bells tolled again, heavy, unyielding, as the gates closed behind him. Sir Thomas Armstrong, Knight of England, soldier of the crown, was now prisoner of treason. His journey from honor to ruin was complete, and before him stretched the long shadow of judgment, a shadow that would end not in silence, but in the brutal theater of Tyburn. In the heart of London stood a place that reeked of despair more than any battlefield. Newgate Prison. Its walls were not mere stone, but monuments to centuries of misery. Dampness seeped from the ceilings like the very breath of the condemned. The air was heavy, choked with the stench of mold, of unwashed bodies, of death lingering in corners where even light dared not remain. Here Thomas Armstrong awaited his fate. But awaited is too gentle a word, for in truth there was nothing left to await. The verdict had been written long before he crossed the threshold of these rotting corridors. There would be no fair hearing, no weighing of evidence, no chance to speak in his defense. His guilt had been decided the moment his name was tied to conspiracy, the moment his enemies needed a body to satisfy the crown's vengeance. In Newgate, time did not pass as it did in the world beyond. Hours stretched, broken only by the drip of water down stone, the rustle of rats scuttling across straw, the moans of prisoners who no longer remembered the sound of freedom. Chains bit into Armstrong's wrists, cold iron carving bruises into flesh that once grasped the knight's sword. His body sagged, but his mind clung stubbornly to fragments of prayer, whispered in the darkness as though heaven might still hear a man already condemned on earth. This was no ordinary prison. It was theater before the theater, a staging ground for the great spectacle of Tyburn. The guards knew it, and their mutterings in the corridors carried the cruel certainty of what tomorrow would bring. They spoke not of justice, but of the show, of the crowds that would gather, of the whips snapping above the horses, of the cheer and horror mingled together when Armstrong's body was torn apart. They savored it as if describing a feast, for in their eyes treason was not simply punished, it was consumed by the public, devoured as spectacle. The king's justice was not blind. It never had been. It was deliberate, sharp-eyed, and merciless. It sought not balance, but performance. Vengeance dressed as law, cruelty sanctified by ritual. The gallows at Tyburn were not instruments of silence, but of proclamation. And Armstrong, sitting in that narrow cell, was no longer a man. He was a message. Every stone of Newgate whispered that truth. From the graffiti scratched by hands long turned to dust, to the groans of men whose names history never bothered to remember, the prison spoke with one voice. You do not leave this place as you entered. You leave only as a shadow of yourself, carried in chains to feed the hunger of the crowd. And Armstrong, once knight and soldier, knew it. He had ridden with banners, he had feasted in halls, he had clasped the hands of princes. Now his company was straw and vermin. His crown was rusted iron, his future the sharpened blade. There was no dignity left to grasp, no honor to reclaim. Only the inevitability of Tyburn, rising before him like a black sun. In that silence, broken only by his own breath and the far-off tolling of a bell, Armstrong faced not only the end of his body, but the erasure of his name. For this was the crown's true aim, not simply to kill, but to unmake, to scatter his memory as they would scatter his limbs. And so he prayed, not for life, for that was already gone, but for the strength to endure what tomorrow demanded. For the spectacle of vengeance was already prepared, and the curtain would rise soon. Newgate had served its purpose. The actor was broken, the script was written, and all that remained was the stage. They brought him forth to the gallows at Tyburn, where the air itself seemed charged with anticipation. Thousands pressed shoulder to shoulder, their voices a low rumble, not of prayer, but of hunger, for the spectacle, for the cruel liturgy that treason demanded. Children were hoisted upon shoulders, merchants paused their trade, beggars pressed against nobles in the same restless tide. All eyes fixed upon the scaffold where Thomas Armstrong, knight-turned-traitor, was delivered into the ritual of his unmaking. The first act began with the rope. Coarse hemp, looped tight around his throat, its fibers biting into skin, already pale with fear and exhaustion. With a signal, the frame gave way. His body dropped, jerked, convulsed. His chest heaved against the strangling cord, desperate for air that would not come. His lungs drew not breath, but fire. His veins throbbed with the agony of suffocation. The world blurred into darkness, vision shrinking to a tunnel of sparks and fleeting shadows. In that fleeting instant, death brushed close, yet mercy was denied. Before it could claim him, hands cut him down, dragging his half-conscious body back into the grip of torment. The crowd roared, for this was not execution, but performance. The second act came with steel. The knife glinted beneath the pale light, cold, merciless, eager. It found its mark in the hollow of his belly, tearing upward with a cruel precision that turned flesh into theater. His scream split the air, raw and ragged, before dissolving into gasps that could no longer hold sound. The executioner's hands plunged within, grasping what nature had hidden. First the entrails coiled and steaming in the chill. Then the heart, still trembling, still pulsing with the last rhythms of life. It was lifted high before the multitude, a trophy wrung from agony, as though triumph itself could be carved from another man's torment. The people cried out, not in pity, but in awe of the spectacle ordained by law. Armstrong's voice broke, then fell into silence, not by choice, but because his body could scream no longer. Yet still, it was not the end. The theater demanded its final act. Horses were led forth, their nostrils flaring, hooves stamping upon the earth like war drums. Their sleek bodies trembled with nervous energy, as though they too knew the role they were about to play. Ropes were fastened, wrist to wrist, ankle to ankle, stretching Armstrong's broken form between them. He lay splayed upon the earth, more shadow than man, yet still alive enough to feel the weight of what was coming. The whips cracked. The beasts lunged in opposite directions. What followed was not a sound the human ear was meant to endure. It was the tearing of sinew, the snapping of bone, the slow, brutal unraveling of a man. His body, once whole, was riven into pieces, torn limb from limb beneath the eyes of the crowd. A leg wrenched free, then an arm, each fragment pulled away until the figure that had been Thomas Armstrong was no longer recognizable as human. It was not death, it was dismantling. The air shook with the sound of unmaking, as though creation itself recoiled at what men had wrought. At last, when his body had yielded its final protest, when silence fell over the ruin that had once been a night, the pieces were gathered. His limbs, tokens of terror, were destined for city gates, grim sentinels to remind all who entered what awaited traitors. His head, severed from its ravaged frame, was raised upon a pike, forced to stare forever over London streets. In death, Armstrong was made not a man, but a message. His flesh transformed into warning, his agony into law, and the crowd, sated at last, dispersed. But the echo of that day lingered. The rope, the knife, the horses, the theater of fear. At Tyburn, justice had not been done. Something darker had taken its place. To the crown it was victory. The sentence carried out, the traitor obliterated, the ritual of vengeance completed before the eyes of the kingdom. The king's justice had spoken in rope and steel, in fire of breath and thunder of hooves. On that field of Tyburn, monarchy declared its dominion not with laws but with entrails. To the crowd it was sermon, a sermon not in words but in flesh. Mothers clutched their children close, forcing their eyes open to the lesson. This is the fate of treason. Men jeered, their voices hoarse with false courage, mocking the broken remains of a man they scarcely knew. Women crossed themselves, lips whispering prayers neither for the dead nor the living, but for the fragile safety of their own kin. The multitude shifted between awe and dread, but all understood the message carved into Armstrong's body. The crown forgives nothing. Yet beneath the spectacle, another truth pulsed, subtle but undeniable. Such cruelty revealed not confidence, but weakness. A throne that must tear a man into pieces is a throne that trembles. A ruler who must scatter bodies across his realm is a ruler who fears his realm's memory. For terror is not the language of the strong, it is the crutch of the uncertain. Fragments of Armstrong became fragments of warning. His arm, nailed upon the gate of a provincial town, stiffened in grotesque imitation of a blessing. His leg dangled above another city's wall, blackened by sun, chewed by crows. His head was carried through London streets, borne aloft upon a pike, and fixed above London Bridge. There it leered over the Thames, dripping slowly into the waters that had carried kings, merchants, and exiles alike. Each drop of blood sank into the current, spreading far beyond the capital, whispering his story to villages and harbors. Children whispered too, some in awe, their small voices trembling as they retold what they had seen, that the heart of a man had been held aloft, that horses had torn him apart. Others whispered in terror, afraid that even their breath might be judged as treason. And so the tale of Armstrong, meant to extinguish rebellion, spread instead as shadow. The memory of his ordeal became a living rumor, one that could not be quartered or nailed to any gate. For the people carried home more than fear. They carried questions. Was this justice, or was it vengeance disguised in ceremony? Was the king truly secure, or did the very brutality of Tyburn reveal a monarch haunted by the ghosts of past rebellions? England had seen a king executed before, an axe falling at Whitehall, a crown toppled by its own subjects. And in every whip crack, in every drop of blood shed at Tyburn, echoes of that history returned. Armstrong's death was meant to close the chapter of conspiracy. Instead, it opened the book of doubt. It reminded the people that their rulers lived in fear of their own subjects, that power preserved by spectacle is power that knows its own fragility. The theater at Tyburn ended in silence, but silence that carried weight, an unspoken recognition that kings may kill, but kings too can fall. So the crown claimed victory. The crowd swallowed its sermon, but history would remember differently. History would remember that on that day, beneath the gallows of Tyburn, cruelty became confession. A confession not of Armstrong's treason, but of the monarchy's fear. Thomas Armstrong was erased from the earth, his flesh torn, his bones scattered, his body broken into fragments that the crown believed would vanish into silence. But men do not disappear so easily. Death may strip a name from the rolls of nobility, may scatter remains to the corners of a kingdom. Yet memory has a way of enduring, and Armstrong's death spoke louder than his life ever could. For generations, England remembered the sight of him, not as a knight, not as a conspirator, not even as the man he once had been. He was remembered as a lesson, carved into bone and blood. The rope, the knife, the horses, these became not only instruments of his torment, but symbols etched into the minds of all who watched and all who heard the tale whispered afterward. His agony became a kind of scripture, a grim catechism of obedience, repeated in hushed tones long after his body had rotted away. Mothers told their children of him when they warned against rebellion. Fathers invoked his name when they spoke of loyalty and betrayal. Preachers folded his fate into sermons as proof of divine justice upon traitors. But the memory was never clean, never simple. For even as his death was used as warning, it carried within it another truth, that the crown had trembled, that only a throne uncertain of its strength would need to tear a man so utterly apart. Armstrong's scattered remains may have testified to treason, but they also testified to fear. The theater of kingship is built not only upon loyalty, but upon spectacle, and in that theater, Armstrong's death became part of the script. His silence became the echo. His end became the mirror in which every subject saw not merely the image of a traitor, but the cost of defiance. Each gate adorned with a severed limb spoke louder than sermons. Each pike crowned with a head taught more than laws. The monarchy had written its authority in his body, but in so doing, revealed the fragility that lay beneath the crown's glittering surface. Armstrong himself was gone. The man who once held sword and title, who once dined in halls of power, had been reduced to fragments cast to the winds. Yet what lingered was not his absence, but his presence, magnified, distorted, reshaped by the memory of violence. He could no longer defend himself, could no longer protest his guilt or proclaim his innocence. But in that very silence he endured. His memory slipped past the rope, past the knife, past the horses that had torn him apart. It clung to the minds of those who saw, to the whispers of those who repeated the tale, to the ink of those who would one day write it down. And so, his death became more than the end of a man. It became a story, one that carried the weight of defiance in the shadow of tyranny. It reminded England that cruelty may silence a body, but it cannot silence the questions that cruelty awakens. That tyranny may scatter flesh, but memory resists. Memory lingers. As the sun set over London, the skyline darkened against a blood-red sky. The crows circled above the gates where his remains swung, black wings beating against the dying light. The Thames rolled beneath London Bridge, carrying drops of his blood into the vast waters of the realm, and in the hush that followed the day's spectacle, a silence settled, one that did not forget. For the crown could command the rope, the knife, the horse, but it could not command remembrance. And in that unshackled realm of memory, Thomas Armstrong lived on, not as the crown decreed, but as history chose to remember.